Okay, so this is a conversation that we're attempting to do that's going to be as if somebody has just asked us. So, you guys said you're working on this big kind of meta project together. Uh, uh, what is that? And how are you guys working on it? Where are you going? How are you going to get there? Um, and this is Michael Smith, a close friend of mine for many years. And yeah, we're going to just have a conversation about that that is attempting to be short. Um, so um, I would love to hear you lay out in a minute or two the Gen 2 to Gen 3 model that you have, um,
Mhm.
and which is sort of based on another model. But um,
Yeah, yeah. I'm just suddenly noticing it might have been great for me to think about how to compress it. Um, so the uh, uh, this, so the gist of like how people use their minds, like there's a lot of interpersonal that's at the foundation of how people use their minds. A lot of how we construct language and we think through things. Um, and For me, the center of focus, and I'm trying to avoid using like these like the larger model of what's going on with memes and memetic reproduction, which is kind of
mhm.
tricky to do in this context. Um, but the thing is that you can see culture sort of flowing through people, and the ability for culture to land in someone and sort of work through them is a fundamental way that people coordinate. Language being a really basic example. When I think of like the first generation of, I know that of the in another context they talk about what is it, cultural operating systems, and I think of
Mhm.
these as memetic operating systems. But if I'm trying to make it succinct and trying to set aside, okay, let's not talk too much about means and what's at the core. I could just as well say cultural operating system for the sake of simplification. Um, so in my mind, the first generation of sort of well, if you think of culture as software, that's moving between people, um, and it helps them to coordinate, you need to have a way that that software can sync up between people. So you need to have some kind of standardized interface for each person that can work between individuals. So the first level of that, first generation of that, would have been language, so that people could talk and have the sense of, when I say the word tree, we both are thinking of something compatible enough that we can coordinate about what we're talking about. Um, so uh, it seemed to me that, and based on a lot on David Deutsch's ways of expressing how memetic evolution works, um, and also the things that the collaboratory LSA would refer to in terms of humanity too, that there's a way that culture figured out how to coordinate large groups of people, and by large I mean on the scale of like cities and ultimately nations, like needing to be able to coordinate much larger than Dunbar's number, much larger than tribal scale. In order to do that, the programs that go between people have to be able to control their host's behavior.
Mhm.
And the easiest way for that control of behavior to go is through something that's kind of like the way that you can train a dog with reward and punishment.
Mhm.
If you can internalize the hooks of reward and punishment so that culture has sort of immediate access to the animal's reactions, then there's a
Right.
way to
Yeah. You
control.
must do this. You must not do that.
Right. And for various reasons, culture seems to have biased strongly towards the you must not and a lot of punishment as part of its structure.
Mhm.
So that's the second generation operating system, one that's based predominantly on essentially using trauma and trauma structures and trauma reactions in order to control and shape behavior. Um, and but there's an artifact where being able to notice and orient to that operating system and the code that's going through you could interfere with its ability to control you. So there's a way
Mm.
where the natural way that that software will work will tend to undermine the attempt to take in
Right. It hides
awareness.
itself.
Yes, it is
Um,
self-hiding.
yeah, and therefore is producing of blind spot dynamics sort of more generally.
Right.
it's on team blind spot.
It's strongly on team
Yeah,
blind spot, and it's also on team what I think of as mind shatter, because if your mind becomes too coherent, you're able to see around your own blind spots.
right.
Um, so the so when I look at a Gen 3 memetic OS, Gen 3 cultural operating system, uh, what I'm looking at there is, well, the shift that would be if the foundation, if that somebody is using for to determine which software grows best. And I say grow because I'm sort of mixing biological and software metaphors. I tend to think of this more like gardening,
Mm-hmm.
because it's more based
It
on
is
biological
ecological. Yeah.
evolution. Um, but the main difference being this business of consciousness, so that the thing that's having these patterns move through, rather than being an external force that induces, is more like an internal. I want to say something like a seduction,
Mm.
where but the seduction is transparent. Where the reason that software moves through you is because it makes it very clear what it's trying to do and what it offers the host,
Mm.
and
And
the
you're like,
host
yeah, I like that. Let's do it.
exactly,
Yeah.
yeah.
And Deutsch
So
has all these reasons why that's a harder thing to evolve than culture that the users don't understand and that moves through independent of them understanding it.
exactly, yeah. So like that feels like the basic mechanism, and then stepping one size larger, which I think is just going to be naming the same thing that we name from a bunch of different frames. The shift from Gen 2 to Gen 3 is it is absolutely necessary. Like it might be sufficient, but it is absolutely necessary, as far as I can tell, for the human race to be able to orient to species-wide, species-level issues. Things having to do with taking care of the planet, taking care of the context of society as a whole.
I think I can name why that is, which is you can no longer you can't do top-down coordination if the thing that you're trying to coordinate is the whole thing. Right?
Right,
Like you because you'd have to get outside it, and once you're outside it, it's not the whole thing anymore.
exactly.
So cool. Well, I'm really satisfied with that as an articulation of uh, that piece of it. Um, I'm going to use a metaphor that I've been brewing over the last few months, which I find very powerful for illustrating something about what this feels like from the inside. So you and I, for the uh, duration of this video, have been um, trusting the software medium that we are using and hardware, all of the physical hardware devices to in order to talk. But if one of our Wi-Fi were to, be a little wonky, we would suddenly be realizing, wait, we actually can't rely on, on this. But when it's working, we just rely on it. It just fades into the background,
Yeah.
and um, and we're just working on top of it. And if the Wi-Fi were really uh, busted, right? If the Wi-Fi were really bad, there would be this feeling of like we can't even have a conversation. We are barely able to coordinate to even figure out whose Wi-Fi problem it is. But then imagine somebody figures it out and they switch and they tether from their phone, and now, oh, finally we can talk.
Mm.
As far as I can tell, there is another step change above the finally we can talk of the Wi-Fi is not broken that occurs when there's a sense of trust among people that they're all approximately, and interestingly, the trust seems to even show up experientially when it's approximate and temporary, but when they're all running this new memetic operating system, the Gen 3 one, there's this new feeling of trust of like, oh, finally we can talk about anything. Is maybe how I would characterize it. And it's as above the feeling of finally we can talk as the ordinary finally we can talk is above the experience of trying to talk when the Wi-Fi is broken in terms of the quality of it.
Yeah.
So that's like what's compelling about it from the inside.
Um,
Now, there's a lot I don't understand about why that feeling is even as strong as it is when it can also be so temporary. Like, but that is also true with the Wi-Fi, I guess, in another way. It's like there's a feeling of, oh, we can tell, we have common knowledge that we are now talking on a high bandwidth, low latency connection. Amazing, we can talk. And that is true even if the Wi-Fi goes out 10 seconds later. Like you can feel it, even if it's very temporary.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's this, yeah. Like I keep coming back to this thing of how, like, what happens inside of an individual and what happens in culture are very, very analogous. Like what it means to actually
Mhm.
switch out your operating system is going to do the same thing internally that it's doing externally. Like the two happen in parallel. Um, and there's a way where the process that it seems like we're trying to encourage in the cultural space is very similar to what I've experienced on the inside when I recognize that there's some part of me that I have been not listening to or that hasn't been trusting me, to anthropomorphize it a bit. And then instead of going through some kind of shame spiral or stressing out about it, there's actually a kind of listening that happens
Yeah.
and a syncing up that allows for that to move, which can actually feel very miserable at first, but it's free misery that feels it's
It's
like misery
flowing.
of squeezing a pimple, right? It's
Yeah.
and then after it connects in, there's a lot of relief, a lot of openness, and I am more conscious. I'm
Yes.
able to see more of what's going on,
Yeah.
and I can speak more freely
Yeah.
externally as well. So
Yeah.
there's like
Yeah.
this nice fractal scaling thing.
Yeah. Well, and I think that really highlights sort of what's going on here. And going back to the like finally we can talk about anything. It's like what's required to talk about anything is that there is sort of no subject or no perspective on the world that would sort of be unwelcome.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
And that has to be in order to allow this stuff to be conscious enough that the consciousness can be part of the operating system. So if there
mm,
are parts that are not welcome, what that means is either you have to completely destroy them somehow, or they're operating out of consciousness.
yeah. And it's a lot harder to destroy your own thoughts than people think. Um,
Yeah. And it's a lot harder to destroy cultural thoughts than people think.
right. You can destroy people, but you can't get rid of the structures that generated
Yeah.
those situations in the first place.
Yeah.
Um,
So I wonder, tracking the time, if maybe like we've given some attempt to paint the picture of where we're going or where we're trying to go.
yeah,
Maybe we should talk about how we're trying to get there.
totally. So, um, I mean, one direction is sort of implied by what we've laid out. It's learning to welcome everything, learning to listen to um, uh, all that arises in yourself and in your field of conversation with other people. Um, I'll speak briefly about my non-naive trust stance framework is geared towards creating kind of interfaces between perspectives that people don't otherwise know how to bridge. And so if there's something I trust about myself and you don't trust it about me, then it could be very easy for me to respond to your distrust by feeling like I need to reject it. Otherwise, I'm rejecting my own trust that these are
Mhm.
somehow incompatible. And by, first of all, properly differentiating that you're you and I'm me, or that if we're dealing with parts inside of ourselves, that they are not the same perspective. Um, by differentiating that and then going, oh, actually, turns out it's possible for me to trust something and you not to trust it, for instance,
Mhm.
like trivially, I might trust that the, you know, uh, whatever device is working because I checked it earlier, and you might, not trust that it's working because it wasn't working yesterday when you tried it, or something like that. Um, and so, having this bridge of respecting each other's trusts and distrusts, I think of trust sometimes as well, two things. I think of it as uh, being sort of what truth feels like on the inside, like in first
Hmm.
person. Like trust
Oh,
is
that is
truth in
neat.
first person.
Oh, that is neat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Trust.
And
I would want to say something like trust is perception of truth in first person.
uh sure.
But
Yeah.
I
And then
love this connection.
the other definition for trust I like comes from a paper that says trust is an unquestioning attitude. And I kind of like undoubting attitude. Um, those feel different, but I need to explore and unpack whether that's actually important. But we have gone back to not questioning whether or not the Wi-Fi is working, right? It
Right.
briefly was on our minds when I brought it up earlier, but then it kept working, and we let it fade into the background.
Yeah,
Um,
and important and relevant to the overall picture is that the cause of not questioning is not because there's some sort of thing that thinks that maybe the Wi-Fi isn't working that we're suppressing.
Right. Well,
Right.
but I think that's where you get what I would call naive trust. Like naive trust is
Exactly.
not questioning because uh it would not be okay to question.
Right.
And non-naive trust is something like not questioning because you are perceiving the world and you are given no cause to question. Something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually I think a clearer articulation of non-naive trust than I've had before
Yeah.
either. So we're making great progress here. This is great.
Yeah.
um, cool. Is this what do you? So I've got this whole non-knife trust stance framework. I'm practicing facilitating conflicts for people and internally to myself, and in various other contexts. I'm working on articulating a bunch of the principles and assumptions of that. Those are kind of some of the things I'm doing to help move myself and the people around me and the world at large towards this Gen 3 thing. Do you want to say a little bit about what your work is and how that is pointing in that direction?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm 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 focusing a lot on a lot of the like, the overall arc has a lot to do with the self-referential nature. Like when you're actually aware of when as you get synced up with Gen 3, there's going to be a lot of awareness about the operating systems and about the fact that you're going through this installation process and why, etc. Which and that's really in an important sense the only context in which you can understand this arc beyond just it being a bunch of ideas, but rather something that's embodied. So
It's
a
very
lot of
loopy.
it's incredibly loopy, yes. And that's actually that's the core in almost the way that pain ends up being the core of Gen 3. This kind of loopiness is the core of pain is the core of Gen 2. Loopiness is the core of Gen 3.
Yeah.
Um, so the what I'm focusing on has to, prioritizing in myself and then seeing how my interactions with others uh, can be shaped by the focus on the internal. That echoes into, so less abstractly, I'm currently holding a space, an online space. Current name is Mage for this, where I'm running people through. Um, it is meant as my practice. Like that is the like if I were trying to teach people something, then this would become immediately glitchy.
Mm,
But if
hmm.
I am sharing, and it's not like there's something against teaching, but like um, but it's teaching as a practice rather than teaching to tell people what to do
Hmm.
or to get people to be a certain way. So having the holding of the space as my practice, that embeds the loopiness in the space that gives others an opportunity to practice and internalize the same sort of pieces. And some of those pieces include noticing when you're embedded in a context, whether you're focusing on the way that you are operating internally and how it's reflected in the environment, or whether you're trying to make the environment do something different, right? So the
Right. Yeah.
loopiness goes all the way through. But this is zooming in on very specific practical things about are you getting lost in terms of experiences like feeling like you're chewing yourself out and you wake up in the morning and you feel awful because you know there's something you should be doing but you're not, or you keep having the same kinds of romantic problems, or there's this interpersonal thing that's really frustrating. Um,
And
so
you're
like zooming,
focusing on basically bringing people's awareness to those dynamics.
yeah, yes, we're highlighting the like these. We're noticing not only here are the problems in my life. I mean, it's not about problem solving. It's about noticing the way that one's being is being reflected in the environment.
Cool.
It's
Yeah.
and so that focus is giving me a lot of reflection on how my efforts to embody the Gen 3 stuff are being reflected in this environment.
Yeah.
So
Right. 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 Yeah. I think there's a lot more for me to understand here. So at some point, maybe I will properly interview you about this whole thing. But
sure.
for now, let's wrap that there. It connects with something for me that maybe I'll sort of say as some sort of concluding piece here, which is that for from 2012 through 2020, um, uh, I was orienting to a model of this from Jean Robertson, um, who had her own mapping of a 1, 2, 3 shift, framed somewhat differently, but they so approximately correspond. And um, and something really important for me happened in mid 2020 where I stopped treating it as her paradigm that I was orienting to, and I started treating it as my paradigm that I was orienting to. And I think this is related to, I'm bringing this up because it's related to the loopy thing that you just pointed at, and relating to why, if you were trying to teach people as your aim, not as a practice for yourself, you would be doing a confused thing. Because there's a sense in which, in order for the Gen 3 OS to work, um, people need to be each holding their own understanding of what it is. And to some extent, I had this when I was relating with Gene, but when I had some sort of critique of the, and not even critique, it's like before a critique, when I had something I didn't understand, something that didn't understand how to be integrated with this model, I would often take it to her and say, uh, hey, what about this? And if she didn't know how to listen to whatever I was bringing up for whatever reason, in part perhaps because I was bringing it up in a way that was, didn't make a lot of space for her experience or whatever else was going on there, I would end up feeling like my perspective wasn't welcome. And the shift that I made was realizing I need to welcome all of my own perspectives. And everybody needs to welcome all of their own perspectives. Now, it's also nice when we get the chance to welcome others, but that in order to be even doing this thing yourself, you really need to be taking that responsibility for yourself. And what that meant was I had to be willing to say, well, I think I understand things that you don't, but that doesn't mean you don't understand things I don't. But I'm going to have my own actual best model of how this whole thing works. Um,
Yeah, it seems important to note. There are two notes that feel
yeah,
super relevant
yeah.
for this. One is that, but my perception, I imagine you agree with this, you cannot welcome others to the extent that you're not welcoming all parts of yourself.
Yeah.
Right. So trying to figure out how to welcome others in order to do a right cultural thing without doing the internal work is it's a no go.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and closely related to that, one of the features of anything that is any of the kinds of patterns that are going to operate better in Gen 3 than in Gen 2
Mm-hmm.
is that their basis for spreading is that they offer value. And what that means is, like, there's some logic to it that I'm skipping over for the sake of the summary,
Mm-hmm.
but the punchline is that you should expect to see these patterns arising spontaneously in multiple places, rather than it being one thread that passes from one person to another.
Mm.
Okay? And the reason that's
Right.
important is that, like, it's relevant that Gene has this model of humanity one, humanity two, humanity three that's basically the same as
Mm-hmm.
Jane's
And
model in
also
Gen
it
3.
models it as popping up in parallel.
Right, and the same thing happens with, I forget his name, but the guy who had like Empire
Yeah, yeah.
to
Robert Gilman's Foundation
yes,
Stones.
right, and we just found out, oh, he's got a three-stage model that
Yeah,
covers
yeah.
almost exactly the same things, and so this is actually a feature, and the thing with that feature is not, oh, look at how often it's showing up, that means you can trust it, but what that means is there is a way for it to spontaneously arise in you.
Right. And the thing you are looking for is the thing that does that.
Exactly,
Yeah. If you have to get it from somewhere else, it's not the thing.
exactly,
But it might be at a useful pointer at the thing.
yeah. So
Um, yeah.
my
And
licensing
and
sentence.
part of what's so confusing is, like, Gene would have agreed with that, right? Like but we were unable to, for many years, sync up about that. And so I kept sort of, we had a lot of oscillations and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, cool. Well, I think that we're definitely over the intended time. This has all been super juicy. I don't feel like we've made a mistake here. If we had made a mistake, we would have to throw out the video and start over. Um,
And then
or,
flog
or,
ourselves.
or throw out the whole universe and start over. Um, yeah.
Cool.
So, yeah. Uh, cool.
Yeah. So hypothetical third person. How much sense did that make?
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. Um, great question, Michael. Let us know in the comments or in some sort of message to one or both of us how much sense that made to you. We're aware that we made reference to a bunch of topics that we didn't unpack, but you got to go dense sometimes. There are other places, other resources, and also, if you have more questions, we can make more videos elaborating on those questions. So, yeah.